Hi there everyone, my name's Aaron. I'm the primary author of SQLBoiler, and today I'm here to take you through V3 to show you what's new in it and to show you how much better it can make your life when dealing with databases. You could also read this information from the changelog. Changelog is complete in the V3 branch. However, sometimes it's nice to get a little bit extra information or see how a particular feature might help you out. It can be a little bit opaque reading it from a changelog. So with that, let's get started. So the major themes that we've got going on here in V3 for SQLBoiler is the out-of-band drivers, and to basically just give users more control over generation. A lot of the bugs that we've found that people are filing are because of name collisions or something not generating exactly like they'd like. So there's a lot more control in SQLBoiler V3. And there's also a whole bunch of long-standing features that people have been requesting that we couldn't do because they were breaking changes. We take breaking changes very seriously, just like the Go1 compatibility contract. You'll see that there's a lot of actual breakage in V3, something that Go2 is not going to do, but it was something that we had to do to make sure that our API was very nice. So we're going to start with the changes. And the changes, we're starting with the changes because they're the most important things. They're also what's going to break you if you were using SQLBoiler v2, and so we've got to check those out first. So the very first one is, of course, I talked about the split drivers. The split drivers are basically now individual binaries. So if you use the Postgres driver or the PSQL driver, it is now a separate binary. So you have to do two go gets, and you can see that at the bottom. In the old way, we simply said, go get SQLBoiler, and we had all the drivers inside it. The new way is you get SQLBoiler, and then you also install the extra driver. This is nice because in cases like SQLite 3, that driver has CGO in it, and not everyone appreciates that, especially people on Windows who have to go download SQLite installer and install it to get the .so, or rather the .dll, in order for the SQLite 3 library to compile. So this was a major reason why we took out, or why we separated the drivers rather. So the drivers are just binaries that communicate over JSON, over standard in, standard out. That makes it pretty easy to debug when they're kind of behaving weird. The Postgres driver also got renamed PSQL. It just kind of suited everything: MySQL, MSSQL, and now PSQL. Drivers can now supply templates, which means that, for example, Upsert is no longer provided by SQLBoiler itself because it is database engine dependent. And so now MySQL, Postgres, and MSSQL, all of those drivers give you a template inside them for an Upsert, which means they take care of that, not SQLBoiler. They also now individually provide config defaults and validation for everything. This means that the defaults for Postgres live in the Postgres driver. It's no longer something that SQLBoiler has to concern itself for every single driver. And all configuration is passed through. What this means is that any config file, or any config value that you want to push into a driver, it will just accept. And so this can be anything. This is good because drivers can now evolve their configuration needs without SQLBoiler needing to interfere. All right, so the next one is context and the DB handle. We moved the DB handle. So in the past, if you look at the old stuff down at the bottom of the slide here, you'll see that we did models.usersDB, and users right there is actually creating a query. It's not executing anything. So it's actually very strange that we put the DB parameter in there. So we thought that with V3, we would correct this, and now you can see at the bottom, you have users and it's empty because there's no query mods or anything that we're putting into that query. And then we call one on that and pass the DB into that. And also there's context there too, which is the next point. We added context support. So context is sort of proliferating itself through the Go ecosystem, and we're by no means an exception, especially because I think in Go 1.8, somewhere around then, the SQL interface, the database SQL package, became context aware. And so we weren't using this before, we are now. This allows you to do benchmarking and tracing, all sorts of cool stuff. You can turn it off if you want. -- no context will take that off for you. But I recommend you keep it on and just pass it through because you have a context object in your request when you're doing HTTP handlers anyway. So just pass that context through, and maybe one day it'll become useful to you, even if you're not using it right now. The other thing that we did was we removed the G and P variants. These are global and panic, and subsequently also global panic, which basically took a global database handle and used that instead of the one that you were passing in, or rather removed the need for you to pass something in. The panic one basically removed error handling. It would just panic instead. We thought that these variants probably aren't used that much by that many people. If we disable them by default, we actually gain a savings about 15% of the size of the generated code. And we thought that was worth it. So they're off by default. You can add them back with add panic variants and add global variants. All right, moving on. The next one is boil.columns. So this is a new way to control insert update column selection. So in the past, if you look at the old way, we only had a parameter for a whitelist. And you actually didn't have to pass in nil. It was a variadic argument. So you just passed in the DB and your user would be inserted. And if you wanted to make sure that only a certain amount of columns would be inserted, you could just put that column name in there, and then only that column would be inserted into the database. Of course, that relies on you having default values somewhere to make that insert work. If you look at the new way, we actually have 4 different ways now to control column insertion. So the first one is boil.infer. This is the same thing as saying not having a whitelist. And basically it does some sort of inference where it selects the columns that are primary keys. It's not going to insert those because it assumes that you're going to get a value back from the database for that. It does the same thing with any default value that's non-zero in your struct. That's the kind of rules it uses. You can read up more on the rules that it does in the README. Moving on, whitelist is the same as just passing name in as before. It will only insert name. Graylist is really about adding. So we had a lot of people complaining that when you were to insert and you just needed one extra column. So for example, the usual case was a default true Boolean. I'm not sure why you would have a default true Boolean in a database, but people had them and they caused problems because the non-zero value for that is false. And so the inference obviously doesn't work for that. So you pass in false and it goes, oh, there's no value here. And it inserts, or it uses the default value, which is true, which is the exact opposite of what you wanted. So then you had to whitelist it, but you had to whitelist every single column in order to use that. Now with graylist, you just add that one column, that default bool true column, and that one will additionally be inserted on top of the whitelist, or on top of the normal inference, sorry. The blacklist is pretty simple. It says don't insert this column under any circumstance, so it does the inference, and then it removes these columns. Pretty simple. So eager loading got some updates. We now attach both sides of the relationship. This is useful for, sometimes you had a function where you would pass just the stuff that came back from a .r from the relationship struct. You would pass those into a function somewhere and then try and get like the previous relation back out of it. And it never really worked because we didn't attach these sides, which was inconsistent because the set operations for relationships do attach both sides. So we corrected the inconsistency. And the big one and the feature request here was that they can now take query mods. That means you can filter or, where clause or order or whatever you want to do on the eager load itself. So if you see in the new, we're doing a user's query, we load the videos, and then we also have query mods for that video's query, because each eager load, between the dots is going to give you one extra query to the database. And so this is the where clause for that. And the videos.tags, that query can also have its own where clause or any query mod. And you can see, of course, at the very bottom of the new part, we can actually do user.r.videos, the first video, .user, and that's actually going to be a user now. That's not going to be nil like it was before. Now, the next feature we've got is rows affected. So we added supports for rows affected. Some people had use cases where rows affected was useful, caching, and all sorts of other interesting things. So the old way, update, update all, delete, delete all, maybe even a couple more than that. They just returned error. Now they have rows affected in it. This is a breaking change. You can turn it off with no rows affected. Decimal numeric types, this is a breaking change, but it was a seriously important one. We used to use float 64 to represent these, which I have no idea why that happened. That was a huge mistake. We've fixed it. So now there's a types.decimal and a types.null decimal. These types will be used when you have decimal, numeric, dec, all these kind of types in Postgres and MySQL and MS SQL and SQLite. So these types are used now instead. They're not great syntax. I want to point that out. We're using Eric Lagren decimal library, and it requires a pointer. Nothing we've done so far has required a pointer. So it's a little bit awkward to use, but it seemed to be the better library. It had far fewer bugs than Shop Spring Decimal, and it also performs better and has more features. So we thought that was useful. We decided to go with that library. It's not going to be a problem. You can replace types, as you'll see, and the new features here soon. So the first new features are we have new database drivers. SQLite 3, long awaited. We had a pull request for this a year ago, and we weren't able to deliver because of that whole SQL problem that I talked about earlier. We really wanted to get SQLite 3 in, but we weren't willing to accept the SQL dependency. So now that drivers are split, we've added SQLite 3 support. You can see the README for details. We also had an independent contributor contribute CockroachDB support. He just finished it, so it's brand new. You can see the README for the link for that as well. We have type replacements now, because right now drivers basically dictate what type you're going to get. When you're using varchar, it's going to turn into a string. And if you didn't like that, you can actually change that now. So the driver gives you the suggestions, and then you can go ahead and replace them. And the way you replace them is with this types configuration. You have a match, and the match can match on any part of the column. So you could even match on the column name if you wanted. There's no regex support there or anything. It's just the fixed string. And you can also match on things like, is it nullable? You can't match on unique, but basically take a look at the column struct, and that'll tell you what you can match and what you can replace. And of course, if you need imports for your type, you can add them at the bottom there. Next one is aliases. So aliases is a really big deal. Most of the time it's not a big deal actually. Some of the time it is. We allow aliasing of tables, columns, and relationship names now. And what this does is it basically just changes the Go version of the name. Never, of course, the version that we use to talk to SQL, or to your database rather. But it does allow you to change the Go names of all of these three things. And the main purpose for it is to avoid collisions. So we've had people report a lot of problems with self-joining tables that join to each other twice, or things that were just maybe unfortunately named, or the plurality of the table messes up. And so you get all these sorts of collisions because of this, because SQLBoiler tries to do a lot for you. You can now change all of these things, but I recommend that you don't, which is why I say don't use this in the slide here. Don't do this unless you absolutely have to. And the reason for this is because probably it's going to be good enough what SQLBoiler generates for you. So I wouldn't go in and tweak names just so they're slightly more pretty, because that's just extra configuration that everyone on your team needs to have. And I don't think that's a really great thing. You can see documentation for full syntax. It doesn't show how to rename relationships here. The next thing is import overrides. So when you're using a custom driver or custom templates, sometimes there might be a reason for you to do this. Again, don't use this feature if you don't have to. I really recommend against it. There's almost no reason to, actually. It just seemed easy to do, so we added it. You can see the documentation for full syntax. More than .go. So this feature was requested because people are starting to use SQLBoiler for more and more stuff. And one of the things that's nice about SQLBoiler is it generates all these pretty structs for you. But you also might want to generate, say, I don't know, some JavaScript that can serialize your model. or you might want to do some protobuf or whatever. Now it's possible to do this. So we've removed the base dir flag. This used to control where your templates and templates test directory are. And now instead you actually specify the templates and templates test directory directly with -- templates. This picks up root directories that are full of templates and singleton directories. You'll probably have to take a look at the docs to understand what that means, but it's there. So what this means is that templates can now be augmented with more file types. It also generation also preserves the folder structure, which is useful. So if you have a whole pile of JavaScript or protobuffer, you can kind of put that in a folder by itself and then move it or do whatever you need to transform that later. Again, this is sort of a don't use this feature. It's a very much advanced use case, and if you don't have to, I wouldn't. Especially if the point is to just replace the templates. I recommend that nobody really replaces the templates in general, because that way you kind of lose out on any updates or changes that we make to our templates. Small feature, query reuse. You can now reuse a query with setargs. It's slightly more performant if you're doing a big for loop and inserting a whole bunch of stuff. There are better ways to bulk insert. For example, if you look at the libpq driver, it has this whole thing on batch insertion. It's kind of a really ugly API, but I don't recommend using this feature to re-implement bulk insertion. It's just not going to be as fast. But it is slightly more performant if you're doing the same query with many args. So you could use this, but again, don't do it unless performance is actually a concern. Measure and then implement. Next thing is whitelist and blacklisting columns. Before you could whitelist and blacklist only tables, and now you can actually pick out individual columns. This is useful in case you have a particularly nasty column that you just want SQLBoiler to forget about. Getting to the miscellaneous additional features, these are smaller features that didn't really require too much explanation. Geotypes for Postgres are now built in. CI text for Postgres is now built in. That's case insensitive text. There is a config flag to specify the config file if you don't like the name sqlboiler.toml or .json or what have you. Bin data is now in use. This is much to my dismay. I really don't like bin data because of the implications for the Git repository, but we were receiving a number of bugs that were like, oh, my templates, they're broken, there's a bug here. No, it's just that SQLBoiler happened to shift around in your Go path and find itself and find old templates, and now you're using old templates. That happens several times, and so it's actually going to be a good change that we've got bin data here. It's just unfortunate for developers. But speaking of making SQLBoiler developers' life a little bit easier, there is a boil.sh build script that can do a variety of things. It can do go generate for bin data. It can build all the drivers, all of that kind of stuff it takes care of. So definitely check that out if you are hacking on SQLBoiler. It also helps you set up databases for testing. It's kind of got the standard usernames and everything, and standard database names that you can use. So very useful. There's also the ability to create an unexported relationship struct. So right now, relationship struct is not exported because we like to keep the API and the Surface API really clean. Unfortunately, sometimes there was reason to want to create the relationship struct. It's when you're passing information back and forth. There is times where, hey, it'd be nice if I could just use the relationship struct instead of creating my own struct that looks exactly like the relationship struct to be able to pass my models around. Well, now you can just call new on the relationship struct, even if it's nil. That's useful. You can check out the changelog for the syntax. And that's it. That's all I've got today. I hope the people that were using SQLBoiler found this helpful to understand maybe how to migrate their applications, what changed exactly. I think I covered pretty much every breaking change, so that should give you a good idea of how to get started with V3. And I hope you guys use V3 because it's really, really good. It's a hugely good release for us. So yeah, that's it. Thanks very much.